Hi, I'm Jason Raupp. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of History and the Program in Maritime Studies at East Carolina University. And today I'll be presenting on behalf of myself and my colleague, Jeremy Borrelli. And the title of our presentation is Exploring Washington's Industrial Past, ECU Program in Maritime Studies 2020 Fall Field School in Washington, North Carolina. So just an overview of the presentation. So we'll start with a discussion of the two sites that we explored through the field school. We'll move on to a brief history of the survey area. We'll focus more attention on this talk on one of the two sites, and then provide an interpretation of that site based on the data that we gleaned through the field school. So the field school, the fall field school for 2020, we originally had planned some other locations, but the issues that arose with the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, resulted in us shifting our focus. And due to some travel restrictions and other issues at ECU, we felt that it was prudent to choose sites local to Greenville in order to ensure that we could provide this opportunity for the students. As such, we discussed possibilities with other faculty here in the program, and Dr. Nathan Richards recommended that we investigate a couple of sites around Little Washington, which is about half an hour from Greenville, if you don't know. One of the two sites that we decided to look at was one that was previously we don't know much about. We know that it was reported by Dr. Gordon Watts, and it was that information was provided to Dr. Richards in 2003. However, no one had actually gone to ground truth that in quite some time. Once we got on it, we realized there was quite a bit there, and decided that that would be part of the focus of the field school. The beauty of this area is that the homeowners in this on this point of land and that surrounding it, and then on the other side is the harbor, Washington Harbor development. All of these folks were super kind and offered any assistance that we needed, and even allowed us to operate shore operations, which made the social distancing required for the field school that much easier. As you can see in the images below here, Washington experiences these blowout events, particularly on very big winds, and in two of these instances, the site was completely exposed. So in the upper photo, you can see a barge that was putting in a seawall and a dock, and it's just up from the actual remains of the stem. And then in the lower photo, we see the remains of a seawall, and the individual standing there is standing out over the remains of the actual shipwreck. A second site was also chosen for the field school. This site was identified through a sonar survey by the 2004 ECU Field School in Little Washington. We designated the site the centerboard wreck. It is actually going to be the focus of a talk given by one of our MA students, Patrick Boyle. So we won't talk much more about that today. Just wanted to give him a pitch, so please tune in for Patrick's talk, because it is a really very interesting site. So a brief history of the survey area. We know that this area was used for quite some time prior to the Civil War, and certainly after the Civil War. We've identified a map dated to 1872, which indicates that there were piles driven into the seabed adjacent to this point of land, which gives us an indication that it was probably used as a lumber holding or a timber holding area prior to that point. Certainly in 1878, E.G. Reed sold the point of land to 28-year-old Eugene Murray Short for $700. And Short's plan was to focus on processing timber resources. The mill was erected and it was burned 3 times throughout the 1880s. And it was used to mill and plane raw materials and then to ship those finished goods by a barge down the Pamlico Sound and onto markets in the north. The E.M. Short Lumber Company was one of the few towns in the area that actually survived the Panic of 1873 and the economic depression that was associated. So they were producing roughly 40,000 board feet of lumber per day by the late 1880s. In 1894, tragedy struck. The E.M. Short and several of his employees were on site when water, the theory is that cold water was added to hot boilers, which caused an explosion in boiler 1 and then set off a chain reaction, creating an explosion that some say could be heard up to 5 miles away. Certainly, the historic newspapers indicate that windows in buildings and plaster on walls and buildings on Main Street in Washington were shattered and cracked. Mr. Short and 4 of his employees were killed as a result of this. This incident is considered in the local lore as the biggest event to have occurred between the Civil War and World War I. So quite an explosion. In 1895, Mr. Short's widow rebuilt the mill, and with the help of her son, managed it and led it back for a few years to a point that they were producing 9 million board feet of lumber per year, and most of their finished products were being sent to New York, to the market in New York. So the site that we investigated lies directly in a little cove off the Tar River, next to the plot of land that was once the E.M. Short planing and sawmill. Directly across is also a point that was used as the Eureka Mill complex. So the site, you can see in the photo in the middle, the students are in the water. The site's not in very deep water, perhaps 4 feet. However, the visibility at the site is almost completely zero. So we used methods that we have used at ECU for many, many years. We use the standard sort of establish a baseline and do baseline offsets and trilateration in order to create a paper map of the site. However, we also incorporated the use of our TopCon RTK GNSS system, which is it's a global positioning system that allows for pinpoint accuracy. So between those two things, you can see the site plan coming together in the field, in the photo. Between those two things, we were able to integrate data and create a really comprehensive plan for the site. So all of the data was recovered. We scanned it all and then digitally created site plans. This is one of the students' site plans. This is Dominic Bush, a PhD student at ECU. We created these, each student took the information and created the site plan, and so used the traditional methods of site plan construction and integrated them with RTK data. So just a little bit about the site based on the information we discovered. We think that it was a coastal schooner. This type of vessel, two-masted, relatively shallow schooners, they were ubiquitous in North Carolina and South Carolina as well. They ranged all through the state. The site is it is a great example, a well-preserved example of this type of vessel, roughly 60 to 70 feet long, 20 feet wide, a nice fast-sailing little vessel. You could see them on the Washington waterfront at any time from the late 19th to the early 20th century. The site plan above is one site that was recorded near Castle Island at Little Washington. It looks very similar. However, these types of sites are inevitably one of the main ones that fill the UAB site files. They were used all through North Carolina. So some things that we learned about the site based on the construction. We only had a permit for phase 1 recording, so we did absolutely no excavation of the site. However, we were able to determine that it was built using paired frames, so it was a relatively heavily constructed vessel. Although most of it, the interior portion of the vessel was buried, we did find that there was quite a bit of the stem and stern assemblies that were that stuck out of the seabed, and we were able to record. So as you can see on the top here, this is a stem drawing, which we were able to determine all of the various various scantlings that comprise the stem assembly. And one interesting thing that we noted that we don't see that often was an iron shoe, which you can see indicated on the front of the gripe. And then if you look in the photograph in the illustration on the bottom, that is the stern profile, and you can see from the different labels the different pieces. So we think we have the stern post with the dead wood coming into it, and then possibly the rudder laying off the back. You can see the possible gudgeon indicated out the back of the stern post. A couple of interesting features that we did identify were these copper and lead through holes that go through from one side of the vessel. They're just transverse holes, not going into the vessel from wet to dry, but directly through, two of which were copper lined, and then the lower one you can see there with the dotted circle, that is a lead lined transverse tube. Those we have really no idea what they were used for. To the knowledge of none of our colleagues, have we seen anything like this associated with a sailing vessel. However, the only explanation we've yet come up with is that they could have been used to pass ropes through. Otherwise, there's no need to line them to prevent chafage, and that possibly they were used for some sort of rigging of some sort of derrick or lifting device. So features of the vessel that we thought were really interesting. So we took the data from the RTK survey. You can see we surveyed along the actual landform, which you can see in tan. And then there's also the remains of old seawall, possibly more than one, that are in the site that lie adjacent to the wreck. So this is really interesting because what we think we're seeing is similar construction to some of the maps that indicate the short mill landform being adapted into an industrial landscape by creating and creating seawalls around that point. So one interesting facet is that we see that the vessel itself lies almost directly in line with this old seawall, which could indicate that it was placed there intentionally, possibly for use as a floating, or even once it settled on the bottom, as a wharf structure. One of the indicators that we might find is you can see a transverse timber on the site plan here cutting straight across that doesn't really fit in the construction of the vessel, but when positioned side by side, you can see the on the submerged seawall that there is a timber on the seawall that almost matches perfectly to that. That may be some sort of indication that what we've got is the remains of a gangplank or some other method of connecting that vessel to the seawall to some sort of wharf structure. So, other things that we found on the site that we thought were pretty fascinating included the remains of a lot of different small machinery. So there's no indication that this vessel was ever propelled by anything other than wind. There's no remains of a centerboard, but certainly we feel that if we were to excavate, we would find mast steps and that this was a two-masted vessel. However, it was never steam propelled. We can tell that through the construction of the stern. But all of these small bits and pieces of machinery may provide us some clue as to the vessel's usage once it's sat in place. So these all appear to be pieces and parts of possibly a windlass or a donkey engine or some sort of donkey boiler. So we found various bits of metal, and then there's a copper pipe going down through the wreck itself that we've yet to determine what it's for, but we also found things like a piece of a turnbuckle and coal. So our interpretation is that this was deck machinery, which was likely used to handle the raw materials and finished goods onto and off of barges. Artifacts, of course, we didn't excavate the site. However, we did encounter artifacts on the surface, which we received a permit from the state UAB to recover, document, and replace. So we shot each of those points in using the RTK to get pinpoint accuracy and replace them. They included this intact bottle, which we thought was really fascinating. It's an early 20th century port bottle made by the Pedro Lopez and Company. It's embossed with federal law prohibits the sale or reuse of this bottle. And that was a way that they prevented resale during Prohibition from 1935 to 1964. Other artifacts that we found, this is a small piece up on the top left, a small piece of lead that was actually lead tubing, we think, which might have been used as a part of the for some sort of machinery. On the top right, you have brick. There were several bricks around the site, and then on the lower left, we have a thick piece of glass that's possibly a ship's deck light, or possibly even a portion of an electrical insulator. And then on the lower right, just a small brass or bronze plate, which would also likely have been associated with machinery. So regarding interpretation of the site, as you can see, when we overlaid all of the data that we recorded, both from the traditional recording methods and the RTK survey, you can see the existing landform and the remains of the old seawall. The old seawall there, we think possibly there's more that just wasn't visible above the seabed that would probably square that point of land out. Now, looking at the way that the vessel lays almost perpendicular to it, our suggestion or our interpretation is that this is a vessel that was driven into place on purpose. Instead of a wrecked vessel or a derelict vessel that was just left afloat at someone's abandoned dock, instead we think that this was probably incorporated as to part of the industrial landscape of this area, rather than expending the capital to develop a wharf structure to take the seawall further out into sea. It was pretty common in the 19th and 20th century to take vessels that were not really suitable for continued service at sea, and use them at the ends of docks to extend the working surface of an industrial landscape. So, based on the material that we found on board the vessel, we suspect that the machinery was actually associated with some sort of lifting device, like a derrick or some other sort of A-frame structure that was used to offload raw materials from barges coming down the Tar River, and then later load finished goods, lumber, onto barges to be shipped out to the markets in the north. So it's a really fascinating site. We really enjoyed working there. It was and it is now to be the topic of a student, Lou Kelly, will take this site and explore its association, the shipwreck association, with this industrial landscape, to better understand the EM Short Company, and then possibly later the Eureka Company, which was on the adjacent shore. So I would please tune in next year, as I'm sure Lou will probably present at next year's conference on this site. So thank you very much, and we really appreciate your taking the time to listen to the talk, and enjoy the rest of the conference.